If Steelers offensive coordinator Matt Canada is going to have a better year, he's going to need a more balanced offense. We're going to talk about that plan, what it entails, and a lot more details right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things of the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. If you're watching this video on YouTube, hit the like button in this video if you enjoyed it. Hit the subscribe button to this YouTube video to get our YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline.net, which has you covered all season long with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Steelers fans, we hope you had a great weekend, but we're back here to talk specifically. It's just me. We're going to have guests throughout the week, but I wanted to talk specifically about Matt Canada and the offense's balance, because we've talked about, different players, different position groups, and all the different things, but how do those position groups combine into the goal of making the Steelers a better offense in 2022? Last year, they ranked 21st in points for and 23rd in yards in the NFL. Considering the struggles that they had with Ben Roethlisberger in his last year in his career, the offensive line playing very not good, and lots of rookies starting in Kendrick Green, in Dan Moore Jr., in Najee Harris, in Pat Freiermuth. It's kind of like, hey, all right, they survived. They that's kind of how you look at it, but they don't need to do more than survive. And I get it was also Matt Canada's first ever year being an offensive coordinator in the NFL. But that excuse is going to be gone this upcoming season. Granted, they're going to have a new quarterback. We'll see how that plays out. But beyond the quarterback, I do think it's important to ask the question, how does Matt Canada balance the Steelers offense? Last year, when you look at the play breakdown, when you look at the comparison of passes attempted versus rushing attempts, it was a 61.8% passes and 38.2% of rushing plays. That's a distribution that I expect to narrow as this year goes on, as this next year starts. Why? Because the Steelers are going to want to run the ball more. Najee Harris is going to become the focal point of this offense. I've said this a lot. I said this when they drafted him, that he is the plan for, as they're figuring out who their next franchise quarterback is, whether it is Kenny Pickett or Mitch Trubisky or some draft player that we still haven't heard about yet, whether it's anybody down the line. Najee Harris is the guy that's going to kind of be the running back who kind of carries the Steelers to when that next era happens. They hope to have them, maybe on the roster now or at worst in 4 or 5 years. But that involves balancing this offense a little bit more, and not just with Najee Harris, because you don't want to run the wheels off him. He had the most touches in the NFL last year. But you do want to have different ways to run the ball. You also want to open up the passing game more based off of that run game, because you need that run game success. I've talked a lot about how play action is going to be a bigger part of this offense. It really wasn't under Ben Roethlisberger the last few years. I've talked about how the tight ends are going to be a secret weapon for the Pittsburgh Steelers, because not just Pat Freiermuth, but Zach Gentry, who I think had a really good OTAs and minicamp, and I think he had a strong finish to last season. I also think Connor Hayward's going to be your third tight end, and I think you're going to see some interesting packages that use the three of them in some ways that help both the run game and the pass game and build off of it. But Matt Canada has to make some tough calls this year. Who is the number one receiver? It's probably going to be Diontae Johnson, but that may be in depth chart. But who's going to get the most targets? Who's going to get the most designed passes? How are those concepts going to come about? So many big plays for Ben Roethlisberger over the years came from option plays, when Antonio Brown or a Hines Ward or a Santonio Holmes had the option to kind of read what the defense was doing and make an adjustment. That's probably not going to happen as much, because that happens when you have a quarterback who knows their receiver, knows their system, and has the liberty to see and adjust those things. They might happen some of the time. They should happen some of the time, because I do think that receivers should have that in today's NFL. But you're not going to see receivers, you're not going to see that chemistry right away. And the Steelers are going to want to find ways to, hey, let's use their athleticism as best we can. Let's, call this in route, this out route, these comeback, but use these different routes and these route concepts and these patterns to make up for a better passing attack. But there's going to be a limitation. I also think that a big part of what we need to expect from whoever is the Steelers quarterback, yes, they're going to have a more powerful arm than what Ben had last year, because Ben's arm was just in a bad spot. yes, they're going to be more mobile than Ben Roethlisberger. They're going to bring those elements to their game. But where Ben Roethlisberger had too was he, especially in the last 2 years, he limited the amount of big mistakes that he made in games that were interceptions. Now, granted, that also limited how many big plays that he made, but I can expect more explosive plays from the quarterback and big throws from the quarterback room that also leads to more bigger mistakes in interception. And that's going to be a tough balance for Steelers fans to accept, because they'll think, man, we didn't have to deal with, as many of these interceptions or as these misreads with Ben Roethlisberger around, because this was his system for 18 years or whatever. But you're also going to be getting back an element that was a part of Ben's game when he was younger, and that he can get the ball down the field further, faster, more accurately, and and having the mobility to extend plays and force defenses to think about it. And that's going to be a big part of this balance, is finding ways. Matt Canada, and he did this very well at Pitt. He struggled with this at LSU and Maryland and other places that he went to, but I've seen him find ways to balance, to force defenses to say, hey, these are our limitations. These are assignments. These are our weak spots, and finding those weak spots and attacking them and getting the offense to be in the best position possible for their playmakers to win matchups that favor them. Getting Najee Harris, and ways to have to have more space to work against, guys that aren't as great tacklers. Maybe more chances to go up against defensive backs when they're running jet sweeps, which we will talk about later in the show. Getting them in space, and say, if there's one free defender, maybe it's defensive end on the other side of the line of scrimmage, or the other side of the formation, excuse me, but as the jet sweep's coming down, there's way too much space for that defensive end to cover, and they're going to have to make a really big gamble to hold their position or attack and say, hey, Diontae Johnson, Chase Claypool, George Pickens, Calvin Austin, whoever's getting that jet sweep, we're going to try and cut you off. Again, we'll talk about jet sweeps in particular at the end of this episode, but I do think it's very important to ask the question, who gets the bulk of everything behind Najee Harris? Because I'm very certain he's going to get the most touches. The run game's going to flow through him. I think a part of the passing game's going to flow through him. But is that next most important person Diontae Johnson? Or is it Pat Freiermuth? Or is it George Pickens? Because we saw videos of him on Instagram just making crazy one-handed catches as he's practicing this summer. We've seen videos of Pat Freiermuth working out with Kenny Pickett over this summer. Who's going to be those people? And so much for so long, the Steelers offense was about who was Ben's go-to guy. For years, it was Hines Ward. Then it was Santonio Holmes. Heath Miller kind of took that mantle for a little bit. Then, of course, it was Antonio Brown for several years. And it started to become a little bit of Juju, but then Juju was getting hurt, Ben was getting hurt, and that kind of messed up their flow. And then last year, you kind of see it become Diontae Johnson when it came to the passing game. But how much of that is going to continue? Will Diontae Johnson be that guy? Will George Pickens become that guy for these younger quarterbacks? My thing with Matt Canada and I guess the challenge that I think is biggest to him is, how do you balance all these talents? We've talked about how Pat Freiermuth is exciting, Diontae Johnson's exciting, all these guys are exciting, but how you balance them and get them their touches in creative ways, not just in a, hey, we're just throwing this pass to Pat Freiermuth because we should. We're going to just give him a streak route up the middle of the formation. No, finding ways to balance the touches and the opportunities for each of these players with the concepts that best match week to week with what defenses are doing. And that is not an easy thing to do. And I think that's something that people don't talk enough about, is how, I think the average football fan who doesn't think about this every day, they'll turn on Madden or something like that, and they'll be like, well, this is the playbook, and this is just the plays that you work with all the time. And yes, you have core plays that you rely on week to week, but each week when you face a new defense, there are new wrinkles, new additions, subtractions, things that have to change, because you're like, hey, they do this really well. This is what we're going to do to counter that really well on the other side of the ball. And I think the biggest challenge Matt Canada faces is how to line that up week to week, but make sure that, hey, Najee Harris is getting the opportunity, Pat Freiermuth is getting the opportunity, Chase Claypool is getting the right opportunity, Diontae Johnson, and it's going to be tough to balance that. And week to week, I guarantee you, there will be losses that the Steelers have this upcoming season where you're going to look at the stat sheet and someone's going to say, well, they didn't target Pat Freiermuth enough, or they didn't target this guy enough. And it's going to happen. It happens in every game at some point to some team. It's part of football. Sometimes game plans go astray. Game situations call for, less running plays, more running plays, less passing plays, whatever, and tougher to go to certain positions, or a team will specifically double team a guy to take him out of the game. But Matt Canada's biggest challenge is to make sure that that does not happen consistently and that there is a pattern that you can see the Steelers have to success. For example, the Steelers were like 8-2-1 last year when TJ Watt had a sack on defense. There's a pattern. The defense, when they got after the quarterback, that's how they won games. The offense, they need to get back to doing that themselves. Antonio Brown had that 5 catches and 50-yard streak for however long that he had that streak. You got to have those staples. If Matt Canada can figure those things out and figure out that balance, that's going to play a big factor into the Steelers' offensive success this year. But there's one player that I talked about in all these guys that I didn't mention enough of, and there's a question that was asked about him. Which player didn't I mention in that last segment? We'll talk about who that player is and how I think they get worked in and why they may be a little secret to what the Steelers do that won't be the driving force of the offense, but a nice little addition who I think will potentially be a game changer for certain moments. We'll talk about that in just a sec. But first, we got to talk to you about BetOnline.net. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting sports and stats and information. With Major League Baseball well underway, the home run derby's coming up. There's a lot of different ways to bet on baseball and have fun with it. Hey, if you're a sports fan, I feel you. If you're like, hey, I miss the days when football, basketball, baseball, hockey, all of it's kind of around each other. That's an awesome time of the year. But how you get back to that time of the year, make some money betting on baseball. It adds more fun to it. And BetOnline.net is the number one source for learning how to make money when you're putting money down on baseball that you're watching. Again, BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information from live betting, playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in the action when you visit BetOnline, where the game starts. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're talking here about balancing the Steelers offense. And I talked a lot of the big names there, right? The tight ends, the top receivers, the top running back. But there's a specific receiver that I get a lot of questions about how they're going to use him. And that's Calvin Austin, because he's really fast, he's short, he's quick. You look at his separation in college and you're just like, man, there's something excited about that guy. And he could maybe be on special teams and he can maybe do this and he can maybe get jet sweeps, all the different possibilities. But I thought this was a good time to pull up a question that we got from a fan who called into the show. I left an interesting voicemail. We have Craig from Portland who asked specifically about Calvin Austin. Here's Craig.
Yes, Chris Carter, how you doing? This is Craig Coleman. I'm looking at Tony Tuesday right now. You guys are talking about the secret weapons being the tight ends. I do agree with it, but I'm thinking of one individual in the receiving corps. What do you guys think about Calvin Austin III? I think he's going to be overlooked because of his height. And once that man gets out in the open, I mean, in his highlights, he was leaving dudes like 10 yards, 10, 15 yards away. If that kid gets open over the middle or over the top when nobody's thinking about him, there's no stopping him. What do you guys think about Calvin Austin III being the top single person as a secret weapon? Love your show. Keep doing what you do. Y'all have a blessed week. Bye.
Thank you so much, Craig, for your question. We appreciate that. And remember, if you're a Locked On Steelers fan or just a Steelers fan that wants a question answered on this show, call into 412-223-6644 or email LOSteelersTopicBag@gmail.com. Be sure to attach your MP3. But in any case, leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question to around a minute or less to get on the show. Thanks again to Craig for your question on Calvin Austin. This is a good question because Calvin Austin is a really fast dude, runs a 4.3. Yes, he's short at 5'9", but he gets away from people. You see his tape in college, and it's exciting. It's what I said earlier. That makes a lot of sense. But I think the real question is, how much will they need to use him? Yes, he could be a secret weapon. The reason I don't see the top secret weapon is because I just don't see any way that he gets enough touches or targets to justify him being that guy. Now, let's look back at the last two Steelers seasons to see what I'm talking about here, because I do think a big part of this is usage and how much the fourth receiver will get used. Now, reminder, Diontae Johnson's definitely number one right now. Chase Claypool comes in at number 2, might get overtaken by George Pickens if Pickens becomes this star player that he looks like he can be at times. Either way, him or Pickens are number 3. And then Austin at 4, and you still have to deal with Gunnar Olszewski and Miles Boykin and other guys that are vying for those bottom of the depth chart spots. But let's look back at how these last few years went. Last year, only 2 Steelers wide receivers got over 100 targets. That was Diontae Johnson with 169 and Chase Claypool with 105. The next closest with Najee Harris with 94 targets. Now, part of that was because Ben Roethlisberger was mainly throwing the ball short, and he did a lot of checkdowns to Najee Harris to get him the football when he was in trouble. I don't expect as many checkdowns. I even think that Najee Harris might get more opportunities to catch the ball further downfield this year, but still get less targets in the passing game. Pat Freiermuth was next to 79. Then was Ray McCloud as the third Steelers receiver with 66 targets, and then James Washington as the fourth Steelers receiver with 44 targets. Now, if Calvin Austin's highly efficient, he can take 44 targets, run away with it, and make a huge splash. And maybe he just if he just catches 50% of those passes or whatever, and maybe 10% of those 50% turn into big plays or touchdowns, then that is a secret weapon. But let's look at the year before 2021 to get another sense of how Ben was operating before his last season. That year, the top 3 Steelers receivers had over 100 targets. We had Diontae Johnson with 144, Juju Smith-Schuster with 128, Chase Claypool with 109, and Eric Ebron was next up as the tight end with 91 targets. But the fourth Steelers receiver still at around 56 targets right there. So you're still looking at a situation where 44 to 56 targets, not a lot throughout the season. Quick math, because I didn't prepare to think about this mathematically wise, but that's around what, 3-ish, 3 a game. That's not a lot of targets to be truly impactful. But if he can spring a couple of those during the season, he absolutely could be a secret weapon. But the reason, Craig, why I said the tight ends could be the secret weapon is because I truly think Pat Freiermuth, last year he was the number 4 targeted receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He also had the third most receiving yards of the Pittsburgh Steelers behind Diontae Johnson and Chase Claypool and just above Najee Harris. I see him getting an increased role there. And then Zach Gentry last year at 25 targets. I see that coming up a bit this year. I also see Connor Hayward getting some targets, but I think he'll be closer to where, Eric Ebron ended up being last season because he missed most of the season with an injury. He finished with 18 targets. I can see him being around there, or even where Zach Gentry was last year with 25. But you also have to remember the amount of targets that are going to go to the receivers are probably going to go down if the Steelers are running the ball more. And again, it's not just Najee Harris. I see them being a team that either someone impresses them at the backup running back position in this upcoming training camp, whether it's Benny Snell, Kalen Ballage, Anthony McFarland, whoever is on the roster right now, Mateo Durant. We talked about a bunch of the undrafted free agent guys, or if they go get somebody because they're just like, we can't wait around for a potential really good running back to develop behind Najee Harris as the number 2 guy. But whoever it is, there's going to be a lessening, I see, of the targets that go to those top receivers. And when there's less going to them, there's less going to the bottom guys too. So to answer your question, Craig, I think he can be a secret weapon. I think that Calvin Austin could be a guy that breaks open some games and that we're all kind of looking at the end of year 1 like, you know what? There's some real potential there. Maybe he becomes a star receiver on this team in some time. But it's just really tough to get the fourth receiver enough targets to be considered, the top secret weapon of a team, especially when you're excited to get Pat Freiermuth the ball and Najee Harris and Chase Claypool. And the reason I said that the tight ends as a group would be the secret weapon is because that's not something that you really thought about with the Steelers too often. Heath Miller was, a threat, but the threat that Pat Freiermuth is different as a receiver. He does different things than Heath Miller. He can go up and get the ball. He's faster. He can get further down the field. Heath was a guy that was an amazing blocker who could also make reliable catches, but he wasn't a guy that made you miss in space. He wasn't a guy that he'd truck you over and get some extra yards, but Heath was that guy that was going to make a guy miss in space and then rip off 10 more yards too often in his career. I think Pat Freiermuth can be that. Can be that kind of guy. He showed that he could be that guy last year. I think Zach Gentry can be another really good number 2 option. And then Connor Hayward could be a guy that you work into some sort of trick play goal line scenarios that as the extra option. And them as a group make them a secret weapon. I think Calvin Austin will have some gadget plays in Matt Canada's offense. We'll talk about some of those gadget plays being jet sweeps in a minute here. But I don't see it being enough to be designated as like a man, like you got to make sure that guy's your guy. Now, I think that there will be teams that say, hey, don't forget that number 14 is out there, or number 19, is out there, because 14 is George Pickens, 19 is Calvin Austin. Don't forget that 19 is out there because he's really fast, and if we lose him, he can take a crack and turn it into a touchdown. But I just don't think that there's enough. You got to think about the targets, the distribution of the football, and again, the challenge that Matt Canada is going to have to balance this offense. And the balance is going to come between, to me, the top 5-6 guys that you're looking at, and that's going to be Najee Harris, that's going to be Pat Freiermuth, that's going to be Diontae Johnson, that's going to be Chase Claypool, and that's going to be George Pickens. Now, who's that sixth guy? That's going to be interesting. It might be a backup tight end. It might be in Zach Gentry. It might be a backup running back if someone steps up, or if they get somebody else. But it could be Calvin Austin, and that would be the interesting spot to see there if he gets the 6th most targets / touches on the team. But part of what could get him that is if the Steelers use more jet sweeps. I wrote specifically about this in my Carter's Classroom column for SteelersNow.com last Friday. If you read it, great. If you didn't, I'm going to break it down even further for you here and go over some of the numbers that I cracked and just the things that I was looking at when I studied the tape as far as how to make that jet sweep option even better this year. We'll talk about that in just a second here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. But first, I got to talk to you guys about RockAuto.com. You can save time and money when you visit RockAuto.com. Why choose to spend 30%, 50%, even 100% more for the same car parts from a chain store or car dealership when you can get them much cheaper at RockAuto.com? For example, a Honda Odyssey fuel pump can run you $353 if you go to the chain store, but just $216 from RockAuto.com. RockAuto is a family-owned business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and RockAuto's prices are reliably low for every customer. They have everything you could need, from brake parts to tail lamps to motor oil and even new carpet. And you can go explore at their easy-to-use website today to find their solution for your auto part needs. Go to rockauto.com right now and see the parts available for your car or truck. Be sure to write Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box, so that they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com today. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're wrapping up here talking about Matt Canada and the balance of this offense. And we've talked about, the overall balance of touches and how that's going to go, who's going to be at the top of the list there. We've talked about working in Calvin Austin as maybe the 6th option in this offense. But part of where Calvin Austin may be the most useful is the jet sweep, which I wrote specifically about. Now, I want people to understand the jet sweep is not going to be a staple in this offense. It's going to be a wrinkle. And the difference, what I mean is, like, when the Steelers, when they had Le'Veon Bell and Marquise Pouncey and David DeCastro, a staple of that offense was their counter trap attack, where Le'Veon Bell would run out wide one direction, and you'd have 2 offensive linemen pull and go lead block. And they did that sometimes 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times a game. Maybe not 10 times, but they did it a lot, in several games. And it was a staple that if you prepared for the Pittsburgh Steelers, you had to stop that play, or they were going to punish you with it game in and game out. The jet sweep isn't going to be that, but it's going to be an important wrinkle to add to your offense to force defenses to think. Now, I went back over and was looking over the numbers and the different opportunities they got. Last year, the Steelers tight ends and wide receivers, because tight ends can be involved in these, had 27 carries for 187 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. Not phenomenal, but also there was a reason for that. It was kind of limited when you looked at the opportunities there. But the majority of those jet sweep plays came with the option with Ben Roethlisberger playing under center. So you're probably thinking, well, what does that mean, Chris? Well, that means a lot of them weren't in shotgun. And the whole point of having it in shotgun is when you run the jet sweep or the sort of option play there, you're forcing the defense to consider at least 3 potential threats to run the football. You have, of course, the wide receiver that might get the jet sweep and take it out wide. And if you miss him, they got the speed and they can hit seam and be gone. You have the running back who the quarterback, if he doesn't hand it to the wide receiver, just hands it off to the running back, and they just attack the standard hole. And you see what they can do. And with Najee Harris, that's a pretty good threat. But you also typically have the quarterback in that situation. And that's why you see a lot more of them in shotgun. And as we reported on at SteelersNow.com during minicamp and OTAs, when the Steelers were doing their jet sweep and their option reps, it was always out of the shotgun, not under center. Mason Rudolph, Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky, Chris Oladikin, whoever was doing the reps, they were working the options and the jet sweeps out of the shotgun, not under center. So that tells me they want to force defenses to have to consider the quarterback as a running threat there. Now, what does that do? It takes at least one other defender out of the play of saying, hey, I'm going to jump all over this jet sweep. And as I broke down in the film, when I was going back over a lot of the plays the Steelers had last year with jet sweeps under Matt Canada, and again, jet sweeps aren't unique to Matt Canada's offense. They're a wrinkle in most offenses in the NFL at some point in time or another, but Matt Canada saw a lot of success with those type of things in college. That was where I think a lot of innovation was said, like, the way that he gets these to succeed was very interesting. The Steelers could see success there, and at times they did. There were some jet sweep plays where they ripped them off for like 25 yards. But when teams started to realize, wait a second, we don't need to assign a person to Ben Roethlisberger, it allowed that 11th man to not be focused on someone that wasn't going to have the ball, but focused on potentially the receiver who was going to get the ball, or Najee Harris or whoever else. But it gives that extra person to make that, to take away the advantage that the Steelers are trying to create. The whole point of jet sweep is misdirection. It is to try to force you to think three different ways. The running back could go this way, the quarterback could go that way, the receiver could go this way. And it forces defenses to say, hey, either you're gonna play very disciplined football, stick to your gaps, and win the battle at the line of scrimmage, or B, you're going to hesitate because you're not sure what you're looking at here, and you're not sure which direction the ball is going, and that's what you're really paying attention to. And if you guess wrong, we can exploit that. If you guess right, good for you. Or C, you kind of did that job where you did it right, but you still didn't win in the hole, and because you had hesitated too much, you got there, but you were a little too hesitant in getting there. You didn't make the tackle, and you still didn't fill your gap. So the goal of this is to cause hesitation, cause misdirection, and cause a little bit of chaos in the defense to open up for the offense to exploit and to find those mismatches. What I talked about earlier, one of the plays that I broke down was a play where Diontae Johnson, initially, he's in a bad spot. He gets a jet sweep. He's 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage coming across the field. There's a defensive end in his way, and it's not looking good. But what does he do? This is a defensive end in a whole bunch of space with nobody else around him. So Diontae Johnson's like, I'm faster than this guy. Let me just run around him. And he does that, and he gets about 5-8 yards or something like that to extend the play and make it a good running play. If the Steelers can find those type of mismatches where the jet sweep results in, if there's a guy in the way in the first place, if it's a lineman, they need to be out in space. They need to be away from the traffic so that there's more space for the receiver to work. If it's a defensive back, it's further downfield so that you've already gained the yards that you're looking for. And now you have your receiver with built up momentum, and there's pressure on that defensive back that, hey, if I don't stop him here, he's probably gone. So you want to find those opportunities for mismatches. And also the jet sweep can create mismatches for other people. For one, Najee Harris, say the linebackers go with the receiver and go or stay with the quarterback, and they kind of sleep on a particular gap, and Najee Harris hits that gap. When he hits that gap, if there's no linebacker right there, then you have Najee Harris taking on maybe a safety or a slot corner or something like that, and that's a matchup you take every single time. But then there's also the potential for the quarterback, which we will see this year with Mitch Trubisky, Kenny Pickett, whoever. If they're uncovered, which does happen, and I think might end up happening more than a few times this year for the Steelers, because I guarantee you there are going to be players who, when they're on the field, they're going to be thinking about the Pittsburgh Steelers, and there's going to be an adjustment period to not having Ben Roethlisberger around. And I think there's going to be some players that forget, oh yeah, we have to cover the quarterback as a running threat, and that's going to open up for whoever's the starter to kind of just, hey, I'm going to take this 5 to 8 yards that they just gave to me because someone forgot to watch me. That happens with a lot of teams. That happens across the NFL pretty much every Sunday at some point, one or another. But I think it could happen with the Steelers. A perfect example back in, now I'm going way back here, 2002, when Tommy Maddox took over for Cordell Stewart because Bill Cowher benched Cordell Stewart. Teams didn't blitz the Steelers, despite Tommy Maddox being extremely immobile, not a guy who could get out of his own way when the blitz was coming. And when they didn't blitz him, he threw for 400 yards. He lit you up and he would rip you apart. But when you blitzed him, he panicked and fell apart. But it took teams a while to adjust to that. And then there was one point where Tommy Maddox got hurt, and then they were playing that let's blitz Cordell Stewart kind of packages when he came back, and he was able to win a few games and be effective because teams were blitzing him. And he was like, hey, when you're not all backed off and waiting for me to make a move, and when you're not all playing in coverage, that works in my favor, because now if you're blitzing, I make those guys miss, and there's less people for me to have to worry about downfield. So it's all about acknowledging what your strengths are and taking advantage of what defenses don't think are your strengths. And this is why I think the jet sweep needs to be a part of this wrinkle, is if they get back to use this. And I'm not saying, make this half the offense, but I'm saying, we talked about what, 27, 27 carries for wide receivers and tight ends. Maybe increase that to somewhere in like around like late higher 30s to lower 40s. Get more opportunities, so it's a couple times a game that you're legitimately forcing them to think about it. And also, with those couple times of games, there's gonna be times where it looks like the jet sweep, but it's not the jet sweep. So again, you're forcing those guessing games. By forcing more guessing games, you force the defense to either have to guess correctly, hesitate, or guess incorrectly. And when you put them at that decision, it gives you more natural opportunities to find weak spots to if you're aggressive and in your attack, to create those opportunities for yourself. So that's where I do think Calvin Austin, because the faster you are to take advantage of those opportunities, the better. I do think that's where, Craig, to answer your question from earlier, where the Steelers could see a really big improvement in making him a secret weapon of the team. But it won't be as making him a featured secret weapon, like something that they design all game plans around. He'll be an added part that it's like, hey, let's catch him with this at this point of the game. But again, it's going to be about how Matt Canada balances it, balancing when to call these options. How many times do you put that in the decision-making hands of Mitch Trubisky or Kenny Pickett or whoever is at quarterback? Find ways to keep defenses on their heels, to take them away their aggression. For the last 1.5 years, because that first 11 games when the Steelers were on that 11-game win streak in 2020, teams for the most part had not adjusted to the short passing game scheme that Ben Roethlisberger was using. Ever since then, when you saw them kind of struggle to end that season, and then through most of 2021, teams were ready for that. They were playing the run, they were jumping up to the line of scrimmage, they were jumping the short passes. If you can find a way to negate that and put them on their heels and force them to have to think about several different options, I don't care if Mitch Trubisky turns out being an all-pro quarterback or a Pro Bowl quarterback or anything like that. You're going to put him or Kenny Pickett or anyone who's at quarterback in a much better spot than you did last year to make better positions, and you'll put in your playmakers, Najee Harris, Pat Freiermuth, Diontae Johnson, whoever, in a much better situation. We'll be talking more about Matt Canada's offense when we get to see more in training camp, but we wanted to break some things down with here. We hope that you enjoyed the Locked On Steelers podcast. Again, I'm your host, Chris Carter. Thanks so much for checking us out. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at SteelersNow.com. Follow this podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, or YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll be back tomorrow with more on your Pittsburgh Steelers.